My name is Ivy Lawson. I'm 38 years old, and until recently, I was the woman people described with words like steady, reasonable, soft-spoken. I live in Portland, Oregon. I work as a financial compliance consultant, though most people don't hear that part. What they tend to remember is that I speak gently, that I don't interrupt, that I smile before I disagree. My husband used to introduce me at dinners as the calm one. It sounded like a compliment. For most of my life, people have mistaken composure for passivity. They assume that because I don't rush to fill the silence, I don't notice what's happening inside it. They think that because I don't react immediately, I won't react at all. That misunderstanding shaped my marriage in ways I didn't fully recognize until it was almost too late. This story isn't about dramatic revenge. There were no screaming matches, no broken plates, no midnight confrontations in the rain. It's about documentation. It's about patience. It's about the quiet difference between being underestimated and being unprepared. The title of the story is simple. My husband emptied the safe. He didn't know I'd photographed every serial number. And before he boarded his flight out of the country, something else happened. The police report was filed before he boarded his flight. But that's the end of the timeline. What I want to share with you is the beginning, the slow shifts that most people overlook, the tiny permissions you grant someone because you love them, the moments you swallow because it's not worth a fight, the way competence can become camouflage. For years, I believed that being calm meant being kind, that being kind meant being patient, and that patience would eventually be reciprocated. This story is about discovering the line between grace and self-erasure. I won't exaggerate. I won't dramatize. I'll tell it exactly as it unfolded, from the woman everyone thought they understood to the woman they realized they never did. If you've ever been perceived as the safe one, the one who won't make waves, the one who can handle it, have you ever wondered what would happen if you simply stopped absorbing the impact? To most people in our circle, I was the stabilizer. At dinner parties, when conversations veered into politics or money, I was the one who softened the edges. When couples argued over logistics, I offered structured solutions without making anyone feel small. I remembered birthdays. I organized travel itineraries. I noticed when someone's wine glass was empty. My husband, Daniel, used to say I was low maintenance. He meant it as praise. What he meant was that I didn't require constant reassurance. I didn't escalate small disagreements. I didn't cry easily. I didn't demand public displays of affection. But what everyone saw as effortlessness was actually discipline. I grew up in a household where emotions were expensive. My mother believed peace was maintained by whoever could swallow the most discomfort without complaint. I became fluent in that language early. Observe first, speak last, never overreact. By the time I met Daniel, I had refined it into something that looked like grace. He was charismatic in a way I never tried to be. He filled rooms. He made bold declarations. He took financial risks with confidence that impressed people. I was the counterweight, the analytical one who kept us grounded. That was the narrative. But narratives have shadows. When Daniel talked about our investments at social gatherings, he often said, "I decided," or "I moved some funds around." Technically, that wasn't inaccurate. He initiated. I reviewed. I flagged concerns. I structured compliance. Yet my name slowly disappeared from the story. I didn't correct him. It felt unnecessary. I knew what I contributed, or at least I thought that was enough. In private, Daniel relied on me heavily. He'd hand me contracts and say, "Can you just check this for any issues?" I always found issues, minor ones at first, then increasingly significant ones. Tax implications, reporting inconsistencies, documentation gaps. I fixed them quietly. He would thank me with a distracted kiss on my forehead and say, "See, this is why I need you." Need is a comforting word, until you realize it doesn't always mean respect. Over time, I became infrastructure, essential but invisible. At family gatherings, his sister once joked, "Ivy probably has a spreadsheet for how many breaths Daniel takes per day." Everyone laughed. I laughed too. But she wasn't entirely wrong. I did track things, assets, insurance, serial numbers, dates. Not because I was paranoid, because I was trained to believe that order prevents chaos. And because somewhere deep inside, I always felt that if something collapsed, I would be the one expected to clean it up. I wasn't unhappy, not then. I was simply contained inside a role I had helped build. Reliable, reasonable, unshakable. The woman who wouldn't overreact. They never asked what it would take for me to stop reacting at all. The first cut wasn't dramatic. There was no betrayal, no slammed door, no suspicious phone call in the middle of the night. It happened on a Tuesday. Daniel and I were reviewing quarterly financial statements at the kitchen island. I had printed everything, color-coded tabs marking discrepancies. He was pacing, phone in hand, half distracted by an email thread. I moved 20 from the joint reserve into the brokerage account, he said casually. 20,000. I looked up slowly. From the emergency fund? It's temporary, he replied. There's an opportunity window. I'll rotate it back in 2 weeks. He didn't look at me when he said it. That was the first detail I noticed. We had agreed, very clearly, that the emergency reserve was untouchable without mutual discussion. Not because we didn't trust each other, but because structure protects relationships from impulse. That had been my argument when we created it. He had agreed enthusiastically. I flipped through the printed statements. When were you planning to mention it? He exhaled sharply. Not angry, annoyed. I'm mentioning it now. That's not the same as discussing it beforehand. He smiled then, a controlled smile. Ivy, it's fine. I've got this. That phrase, I've got this. It wasn't the money that unsettled me. 20,000 was recoverable. The markets fluctuate. Investments win and lose. I understood risk. What unsettled me was the tone. Like I was being reassured instead of consulted. My role was to calm down, not to collaborate. I said nothing for several seconds. Silence has weight when you don't rush to fill it. He interpreted it the way people often do. As a concession. Trust me, he added lightly, tapping my shoulder as he walked past. Trust isn't proven by bypassing agreements. But I didn't escalate. Instead, I documented. That night, after he fell asleep, I opened my black leather notebook and wrote the date, the amount, the time of the conversation, his exact phrasing. Not because I planned to use it against him, because patterns reveal themselves over time. The next morning, I logged into our shared account and confirmed the transfer. I took a screenshot, saved it in a secure folder. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't accusatory. It was simply noted. 2 weeks passed. The money wasn't rotated back. When I brought it up gently, he waved it off. Market timing shifted. I'll adjust next month. Adjust. Another soft word. I nodded. I didn't argue. But something inside me shifted. Not in anger, not in panic. In awareness. The agreement we made was flexible for him. Fixed to me. And the difference between those interpretations was not about finance. It was about authority. That was the first small cut. Small enough that no one else would have seen it. Small enough that if I described it to a friend, they might say, it's not a big deal. But precision matters, and I began to understand that what looks like a minor deviation can quietly redefine the rules of a marriage, if you let it. I didn't confront him again about it. I simply started watching more carefully. If the first transfer had been a single exception, it might have faded into the background of ordinary marital friction. But exceptions have a way of becoming precedents. Over the next few months, small decisions began happening around me instead of with me. A new line of credit opened to optimize leverage. And a short-term loan extended to a friend without written terms. A watch purchased at auction. An investment piece that cost more than the emergency fund we once guarded so carefully. Each time the pattern was the same. Notification after action. Reassurance instead of consultation. Confidence in place of collaboration. And each time I chose calm, not because I didn't see it, but because I rationalized it. Daniel's business had grown rapidly that year. He was managing more capital, networking with higher risk investors, and attending conferences in other states. I told myself that speed required flexibility, that my insistence on structure might feel restrictive to someone moving quickly. So I adjusted. When he'd say, I didn't want to bother you with the details, I responded with, I appreciate that. When he'd say, you worry too much, I smiled and said, that's why we balance each other. It sounded healthy, mature, but something subtle was happening beneath the language. My caution was being reframed as anxiety, my boundaries as rigidity, my questions as doubt. And because I valued harmony, I softened myself in response. At a dinner with his colleagues, someone asked how we divided responsibilities at home. Daniel laughed and said, I make the money. Ivy makes sure the government doesn't come after us. Everyone chuckled. It was meant to be charming. I smiled. But what stayed with me wasn't the joke, it was the framing. He made the money, I protected it, as if safeguarding assets were secondary to generating them. As if compliance were an accessory instead of infrastructure. Later that night, I mentioned it lightly. You know I'm part of the financial strategy too. He looked surprised. Of course you are. Don't overthink it. It was just banter. Just banter. Just 20,000. Just a watch. Just a loan. Just a joke. Individually, none of it justified alarm. But collectively, they formed a pattern. The emergency fund was eventually replenished, but not fully. Numbers were rounded instead of being exact. Transfers became more frequent. When I asked for account summaries, he sometimes delayed sending them. I'll forward it later, he'd say. Later didn't always come, and still I stayed composed, because I told myself that reacting strongly to incremental changes would make me seem disproportionate. I didn't want to be the difficult wife. So I adapted in quieter ways. I created independent backups of our shared account statements. I updated insurance inventories. I began cataloging physical assets in our home. Not an accusation, but an accuracy. If something ever needed to be accounted for, I wanted clarity. Daniel interpreted my continued silence as comfort. He began using phrases like, "You trust me, right?" And I would answer honestly, "I trust documentation." He would laugh, thinking it was a joke. But trust without verification is simply hope, and hope is not a financial strategy. By then, I understood something that unsettled me more than any single transaction. He wasn't hiding things. He simply didn't believe I required full visibility anymore. The shift wasn't loud. It was administrative, and that made it far more dangerous. Roles don't arrive announced. No one hands you a script and says, "This is who you are now." They emerge slowly, through repetition, through tone, through what people stop asking you for. By the second year of Daniel's rapid growth phase, I could feel the role solidifying around me. I was the stabilizer, the proofreader, the failsafe. Reliable, useful, invisible. At networking events, Daniel introduced me with affectionate shorthand. "This is Ivy. She keeps me out of trouble." It always drew laughter. I would smile and shake hands, listening as conversations turned toward venture capital, expansion, and risk appetite. When technical compliance questions surfaced, Daniel would glance at me briefly, then answer them himself. Simplified, confident, occasionally inaccurate. I rarely corrected him publicly, not because I couldn't, because I understood hierarchy in social spaces. Correction can feel like undermining, and I refused to embarrass him. But what I didn't realize at the time was that my restraint was reinforcing something else. He was learning that I would preserve his image, even at the cost of precision. At home, the pattern was subtler but more telling. Mail addressed to both of us was opened by him first. Brokerage updates were summarized verbally instead of shared digitally. When I requested login credentials for a new investment portal, he said, "I'll set up shared access soon." Soon became another elastic word. I told myself that marriage required flexibility, that strong partnerships ebb and flow in leadership. But leadership wasn't ebbing. Access was. One evening, as we were reorganizing the hallway closet, Daniel picked up the small biometric safe we kept on the top shelf. "That thing's overkill," he said lightly. "You're the only one who knows what's in it anyway." I looked at him carefully. I thought we both did. He shrugged. "I mean, you're the one who tracks all that stuff." All that stuff. Inside that safe were important documents, property deeds, backup hard drives, small inherited gold coins from my grandmother, and emergency cash. Nothing illegal, nothing dramatic. Just layered security. It struck me then that he saw the safe as administrative, not strategic. He didn't see it as power. He saw it as paperwork. That was the role I had been assigned. Guardian of logistics, manager of details, protector of systems. Necessary but not central. There's a specific kind of invisibility that comes from being competent. When you consistently prevent problems, people forget the problems ever existed. They assume stability is natural, not maintained. I began noticing how often Daniel spoke about my business, my capital, my investors. The language shift was small but cumulative. What we built together was slowly becoming something he believed he operated alone. And perhaps the most unsettling realization wasn't that he minimized my contribution. It was that I had allowed the narrative to stand because correction felt disruptive. Harmony can be addictive, but harmony without mutual recognition becomes erasure. That night after he went to bed, I stood in front of the closet and looked at the safe. I rested my hand on the cool metal surface, not with fear, with assessment. Roles can be reassigned, but only if you recognize the script you're standing in. The shift didn't happen during an argument. It didn't arrive with evidence of betrayal or a dramatic discovery. It happened on a quiet Sunday afternoon. Rain pressed softly against the living room windows. Daniel was upstairs on a call, his voice animated, confident, pacing. I was seated at the dining table reviewing a stack of routine statements. I wasn't searching for anything. I was simply maintaining order. That's when I noticed a transfer I didn't recognize. It wasn't large enough to trigger alerts. 5 figures, but barely. Moved from a secondary holding account into a new entity I didn't immediately recognize. The entity name was clean, professional, recently formed. I felt no panic, only curiosity. I opened another tab and searched the state registry database. The LLC had been registered 3 months earlier. Managing member, Daniel Lawson. Address listed a co-working space downtown. I leaned back in my chair. 3 months. Not hidden, not disguised, simply unmentioned. Upstairs, I could hear him laughing mid-conversation. I didn't go upstairs. I didn't interrupt. Instead, I continued researching. The registered agent, the filing date, the original capital contribution, cross-referencing our joint accounts. It wasn't illegal. It wasn't fraudulent. But it was separate, deliberately separate. And that distinction mattered. When Daniel came downstairs an hour later, he kissed the top of my head absent-mindedly. "You've been buried in numbers all day." I looked up at him and studied his face. I wasn't searching for guilt. I wasn't searching for deception. I was searching for alignment. "I saw the new LLC," I said evenly. He paused for less than a second. Most people wouldn't have caught it. "Oh, that," he replied. "It's exploratory. Didn't want to complicate things until it's real." "Didn't want to complicate things?" I closed my laptop gently. "Complicate what?" "Our structure. You'd want to vet everything. It's just easier if I test it first." "Test it first." The language was efficient, controlled, but beneath it was an assumption that my involvement was friction, that my questions were obstacles, that transparency was optional if the outcome was uncertain. In that moment, something crystallized inside me. Not anger, clarity. He wasn't excluding me because he feared my reaction. He was excluding me because he didn't see my inclusion as necessary. That realization didn't break my heart. It reorganized it. I nodded slowly. "I understand." And I did. I understood that I had mistaken proximity for partnership. That access had quietly narrowed while responsibility remained shared. That evening, after dinner, Daniel went out to meet a colleague. I stayed home. I pulled out my black leather notebook. I opened a new section. Not titled Suspicion. Not titled Betrayal. Simply Independent Record. I documented the LLC details. The formation date, the transfers, the conversation. Then I did something I had never done before in our marriage. I opened a new secure cloud storage account, registered solely under my name. Not because I planned to leave. Not because I planned to accuse. But because I finally understood something fundamental. Silence is only noble when it's voluntary. Up until that afternoon, my silence had been habitual, reflexive, conditioned. Now it would be chosen. Strategic. There's a difference between being calm and being disengaged. That Sunday, I stopped confusing the two. And once you see the architecture of imbalance, you cannot unsee it. After that Sunday, I didn't become colder. I became quieter. Not in the withdrawn way that invites concern. Not in a way that would trigger suspicion. In fact, from the outside, I probably seemed even more composed than usual. Daniel didn't notice the shift. Why would he? My demeanor hadn't changed. I still made coffee in the mornings. Still asked about his meetings. Still listened. But internally, the architecture had been rearranged. I stopped reacting in real time. When he mentioned another short trip, just 2 days, quick investor check-in, I didn't ask follow-up questions. I didn't offer to review travel receipts. I simply said, "Safe travels." He smiled, relieved by the ease of it. Ease can be intoxicating. Over the next few weeks, I watched how my non-resistance altered his behavior. He volunteered fewer explanations, shared fewer documents, assumed fewer objections. It wasn't malicious, it was human nature. When friction disappears, people accelerate. Silence, when misunderstood, becomes permission. But my silence was no longer permission. It was data collection. I began structuring my days differently. During work hours, I studied asset tracing protocols, not because I needed them professionally, but because I wanted fluency beyond my usual compliance lens. I reviewed state reporting timelines for missing property. I refreshed myself on interstate transport laws regarding high-value items, not obsessively, methodically. At home, I updated our household asset inventory with greater precision. Jewelry, watches, electronics, the contents of the safe. I cross-checked purchase dates with transaction histories. I photographed everything, not artistically, clinically, serial numbers, close-ups, wide angles showing context, time-stamped, stored redundantly. The first time I photographed the contents of the safe, I paused. It felt significant, not because I suspected theft, but because documentation changes posture. When you record something carefully, you're acknowledging the possibility that one day you may need proof, not memory. Daniel continued moving confidently through his world. Deals expanded. Conversations grew larger. His new LLC began transacting modestly. He started referring to it as my side structure, not ours, mine. One evening, as he scrolled through his phone, he said casually, "You've been really chill lately. I appreciate that." Chill. The word almost made me smile. "I've just been focused," I replied. He kissed my temple and went back to typing. What he interpreted as trust was actually recalibration. I was no longer trying to protect the harmony of our marriage by absorbing the imbalance. I was protecting myself from future ambiguity. There's a specific calm that comes when you stop trying to correct someone's perception of you. Let them think you're passive. Let them believe you're unaware. Let them relax inside that assumption. Underestimation is not an insult. It's cover. By then, I understood something with absolute certainty. If a line were ever crossed, I would not argue about it. I would not plead. I would not escalate emotionally. I would respond administratively. And administrative responses, when prepared properly, don't require raised voices. They require timestamps. Preparation rarely looks dramatic. It looks like routine. That was the advantage. Daniel never noticed that I began waking up 30 minutes earlier than usual. He assumed I was answering work emails. Sometimes I was. But often, I was reviewing asset registries, updating encrypted backups, or organizing digital folders with neutral names. Household_archive_Q3, insurance_review, tax_supplemental. Nothing accusatory, nothing paranoid. Just orderly. The safe in our hallway closet remained where it had always been. Biometric access, backup code, a small, solid structure that represented preparedness more than secrecy. Inside were layered items. My grandmother's gold coins, individually wrapped. Emergency cash, banded and dated. Copies of deeds and titles. 2 watches Daniel had purchased as investments. An external hard drive containing historical, financial records. One Saturday morning, while Daniel was out playing golf, I removed everything from the safe and laid it out on the dining table. I moved slowly, deliberately. I photographed each gold coin individually, front, back, edge detail. I zoomed in on mint marks and serial engravings. I placed a current newspaper beside them for date verification. The watches received the same treatment. Serial numbers, certificates, purchase receipts. I cross-referenced the numbers with manufacturer databases. Not because I suspected he would take them, because assets without documentation are just objects. Assets with documentation are traceable. There is power in traceability. When I finished, I reassembled everything exactly as it had been. Same order, same orientation. Even the slight crease in the velvet lining was preserved. Precision isn't paranoia. It's discipline. In the weeks that followed, I began paying closer attention to Daniel's travel habits. Flight bookings, luggage size, duration discrepancies. Again, nothing dramatic surfaced, but patterns emerged. He had begun traveling with a slightly larger carry-on than before. He requested access to the safe twice in 1 month to check something. He asked for the backup code once, claiming the biometric reader lagged. I gave it to him calmly. Then I changed it the next day. Not out of suspicion, out of policy. At work, I requested continuing education credits in forensic accounting, framed as professional development. It was legitimate, it enhanced my credentials, but it also expanded my lens. I learned how investigators reconstruct timelines from fragments, how missing assets are traced across state lines, how intent is inferred from behavior patterns rather than confession. Knowledge removes fear. The more I learned, the less anxious I felt. There's something stabilizing about understanding systems larger than emotion. Daniel occasionally teased me about my spreadsheet brain. "You could probably track a dollar bill across 3 countries, he laughed once. I met his eyes evenly, if necessary. He kissed my forehead, amused. He didn't hear the sincerity. By late autumn, I had digitized every significant asset in our home. Not just photographs, metadata logs, purchase history, insurance declarations. Cloud backups are mirrored to an external encrypted drive stored off-site. Redundancy is quite an insurance. I never confronted him about the LLC again. I never asked why certain transfers were delayed. Instead, I ensured that if ambiguity ever transformed into action, I would not be relying on memory. People assume preparation means anticipation of catastrophe. It doesn't. Sometimes it simply means acknowledging that trust and verification can coexist. And sometimes it means accepting that if someone ever tests the boundary of your calm, you will not respond with outrage. You will respond with records. By then, I no longer feared what might happen. I was curious what would. Because when someone believes you aren't paying attention, they eventually stop disguising their movements. And the most revealing behavior is rarely hidden. It's just unchallenged. The reveal wasn't loud. It didn't come with a slammed door or a frantic bank notification. It came with absence. Daniel left for what he described as a 3-day investor retreat in Vancouver. His suitcase was slightly heavier than usual, but I didn't comment. I kissed him goodbye at the door, reminded him to text when he landed, and watched the rideshare pull away. The house settled into silence. That evening, I followed my usual routine. Dishes, laundry, a brief work call. Nothing urgent, nothing suspicious. It wasn't until the next morning, when I opened the hallway closet to retrieve a document for a client, that I noticed it. The safe was lighter, not visibly damaged, not forced, just lighter. There's a subtle difference in weight you recognize when you've handled something often enough. I didn't rush. I didn't panic. I carried it to the dining table and opened it. The velvet lining was slightly shifted. The indentation where the gold coins had rested was shallower. Inside, the emergency cash was gone. Both watches were gone. Every gold coin gone. The external hard drive remained. The property deeds remained. Only liquid or easily transportable valuables had disappeared. I sat down slowly, and I breathed. There was no confusion in my mind. This wasn't burglary. There were no signs of forced entry. The security system logs showed no anomalies, no alerts. He had used the code. He had taken them intentionally. The clarity of that fact was almost clinical. I didn't cry. Instead, I opened my laptop. I accessed the secure folder I had built over months. I reviewed the photographs, serial numbers, time-stamped images, purchase receipts, insurance declarations. Everything aligned. Then I opened our shared account statements. A large outgoing transfer had cleared at 6:12 a.m., approximately 2 hours before his flight departure. Destination? The new LLC's operating account. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the screen. It wasn't desperation. It was a calculation. He had converted physical assets into liquidity. He had removed shared reserves, and he had done it immediately before crossing an international border. The timing wasn't accidental. That was the private reveal. Not that he took the valuables, but he structured the exit carefully. He didn't argue. He didn't negotiate. He didn't inform. He repositioned, and he assumed I would respond the way I always had. Calm, trusting, patient, perhaps even accommodating. I checked the flight status. Boarding in 2 hours. I closed my laptop and stood up. In the past, this would have been the moment for confrontation. A call, a demand, a shaky why. But clarity does something unusual. It removes the need for immediate emotion. I understood now that the marriage I thought I was stabilizing had already been reframed without my consent. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a unilateral decision, and unilateral decisions have administrative consequences. I returned the safe to its place in the closet, empty but orderly. Then I sat down at my desk. There are moments in life when you recognize a line has been crossed. Not symbolically, but legally. And once you see that line clearly, you don't shout about it. You document it. Because what Daniel didn't know, what he never once considered, was that I had photographed every serial number. Every coin, every watch, every documented asset. And serial numbers have a way of following people, especially across borders. For a full 7 minutes, I did nothing. Not because I was stunned, because decisions made too quickly often serve emotion instead of outcome. I sat at my desk, hands folded loosely in my lap, and allowed the reality to settle into something solid. Daniel had removed shared documented assets without notice, converted them into liquidity, transferred funds into an entity structured solely under his control, then boarded an international flight. There are multiple ways a person can respond to that. Option 1, call him immediately. Demand explanation, invite denial, offer him time to restructure the narrative before facts solidify. Option 2, wait, see what he does next. Hope he returns with a story that softens intent. Option 3, secure a position first, speak later. I chose the third, not out of vengeance, out of alignment. My moral code had never included theatrics. It included accountability. I opened a new document and began building a timeline. Date of last confirmed safe inventory, date and time of his access request, Date of flight booking, timestamp of outgoing transfer, current flight status. I attached the corresponding screenshots, photographs, financial statements. Everything was already organized. All I had to do was assemble it. Then I paused. There is a difference between marital conflict and financial misconduct. I needed to determine which side of that line this fell on. The assets in the safe were jointly held. The emergency cash was designated shared reserve. The watches were purchased with joint funds. The gold coins were inherited by me, but stored as a family asset for security. Intent matters, and so does pattern. This wasn't the first unilateral financial move. It was simply the first irreversible one. I checked the clock. 90 minutes until boarding. I did not call him. Instead, I called an attorney I had worked with professionally. Someone experienced in asset protection and interstate financial disputes. I did not dramatize. I outlined facts. Her voice remained measured. Document everything. Do not alert him yet. If assets have crossed state or national lines, timing matters. Timing matters. After the call, I contacted our insurance provider to confirm policy coverage for documented valuables. I did not file a claim. I simply confirmed the process. Then I opened the police department's online reporting portal. I read the language carefully. Report suspected misappropriation of jointly owned property. Suspected. I didn't need to exaggerate. The facts spoke clearly. This was the irreversible option. Once filed, the report would timestamp the incident prior to his departure, prior to a set relocation beyond reach. It would establish a sequence. Sequence is everything. I hesitated for exactly one breath. Not because I doubted the facts, because filing it meant I was no longer preserving the illusion of internal resolution. It meant acknowledging that what happened was not a misunderstanding. It was action, and actions require a record. I attached the documentation, serial numbers, photographs, transaction statements. Then I clicked submit. The confirmation number appeared instantly. The police report was filed before he boarded his flight. I closed my laptop. There was no surge of triumph, no trembling, just steadiness. Some choices feel loud internally. This one felt precise. Once the report was filed, the situation shifted from emotional to procedural. That distinction steadied me. I didn't pace. I didn't cry. I made tea. Chamomile, out of habit more than need. Then I sat back down at my desk and began the next layer of quiet movement. The first call I received was from a non-emergency officer confirming receipt of the report. His tone was professional, neutral. I provided clarification where necessary, joint ownership, documented serial numbers, timeline relative to the international departure. He asked, "Are you certain you want this formally recorded?" "Yes," I said evenly. "I'm certain." Certainty is not volume, it's clarity. After that call, I contacted the attorney again. We discussed immediate protective measures, temporary freezing of certain joint accounts, pending clarification, legal notice preparation, and formal documentation of asset classification. Everything was lawful, structured, measured. No one was being ambushed. The process itself was the boundary. I logged into our shared financial platforms and downloaded the last 12 months of complete statements. Not summaries, full transactional records. I saved them into the secure archive and mirrored them to the encrypted drive stored off-site. Redundancy prevents revision. Then I changed my personal passwords, not dramatically, quietly. Banking, cloud storage, authentication keys. I didn't lock him out of shared systems. That would have been reactive. I simply ensured my perimeter was secure. Daniel texted mid-flight during his layover. "Boarding soon. Talk tonight?" I read the message twice. Of course, safe travels. No accusation, no hint. He responded with a heart emoji. I stared at it for a moment, not with sadness but with recognition. How often symbols substitute for substance. By late afternoon, the police department contacted the airport security liaison to note the report number associated with the serial numbers provided. I wasn't privy to their internal communication, but I understood how systems function. If assets surfaced during routine checks or later transactions, documentation would already exist. That mattered. I did not inform his family. I did not confide in friends. This was not social drama. It was a structural correction. The most revealing part of that day was how ordinary everything felt. The dishwasher hummed. Rain tapped lightly against the windows. A neighbor walked her dog past our house. Life continued. Inside that continuity, I had redrawn a line. Not loudly, but legally. When evening arrived, Daniel landed in Vancouver and texted, "Made it. Dinner with the group now." I replied, "Glad you arrived safely." There is power in withholding premature reaction. If I had confronted him immediately, he would have shaped the story. He would have had time to explain, justify, and reposition. Instead, the sequence now existed independently of his narrative. Documentation first, conversation later. I went to bed at my usual time, and for the first time in months, I slept without mental rehearsal. Because whatever came next would not depend on memory. It would depend on the record. The first crack didn't come from me. It came from a phone call Daniel wasn't expecting. The next morning, while I was reviewing emails at my desk, my phone remained silent. I didn't reach for it. I didn't check flight tracking. I didn't rehearse what I might say if he called in panic. Because I knew something simple. Systems move quietly, but they move. At 9:47 a.m., my phone vibrated. Daniel. I let it ring twice before answering. His voice was controlled, but thinner than usual. Hey, quick question. Did you file something? I didn't rush to fill the space. Yes. There was a pause, not confusion, calculation. At the airport this morning, I was pulled aside briefly, he continued. They asked about declared valuables, mentioned serial numbers. It was inconvenient. Inconvenient. The word almost mirrored his earlier language about complicating structures. I see, I replied. It's just procedural, he added quickly. I clarified everything. It's not a big deal. Not a big deal. I folded my hands on the desk. Daniel, the items removed from the safe were jointly documented assets. Silence. They're still ours, he said, but the confidence was softer now. They were removed without notice, I answered evenly. Converted to liquid position, transferred into an entity structured solely under your name. He exhaled sharply. I was protecting capital. Things are shifting fast right now. I didn't want to alarm you. Alarm. I almost admired how consistently he framed my inclusion as an emotional risk rather than a legal necessity. Protection doesn't require concealment, I said. He didn't respond immediately. In the background, I could hear airport announcements echoing faintly. They flagged the watches, he said finally. Serial numbers were already on file. Yes, I replied. Another pause, longer this time. You documented everything? Yes. There it was. The first real shift. Not anger. Recognition. The consequences weren't explosive. No one arrested him. No dramatic confrontation unfolded in a terminal hallway. But something had changed. He was no longer operating in assumed opacity. There was a record, there was a timestamp, there was traceability. I was going to move the assets temporarily, he said carefully, for leverage. Leverage requires consent, I replied. His breathing steadied. Are you trying to make this criminal? No, I said calmly. I'm ensuring it's documented. Documentation has weight. It doesn't accuse. It simply exists. When the call ended, I didn't feel vindicated. I felt balanced. The system had acknowledged the discrepancy, and more importantly, Daniel now understood something he hadn't before. My silence had never been ignorance. It had been observed. Throughout that day, small ripples continued. A compliance inquiry from his bank regarding the transfer. A request for clarification on the LLC's operating activity. Nothing catastrophic, but enough friction to disrupt momentum. And friction, when applied precisely, slows acceleration. By evening, he texted, "We need to talk when I'm back." I read it without urgency. "We will," I replied, because the consequences had only just begun. And for the first time in our marriage, I was not reacting to his movements. He was reacting to mine. Daniel returned 3 days later. He didn't announce his arrival with noise or defensiveness. He walked through the front door with the same measured posture he always carried. Controlled, composed. But something beneath it had tightened. His suitcase rolled across the hardwood floor with a heavier sound than when it left. I was in the kitchen, slicing lemons for water. The ordinary rhythm of the knife against the cutting board felt grounding. "We need to talk," he said. "Yes," I replied calmly. "We do." He didn't sit immediately. Instead, he rested his hands on the back of a chair, as if bracing himself, not physically, but strategically. "You escalated this too quickly," he began. "There were cleaner ways to handle it." Cleaner. I poured water into 2 glasses before answering. Removing jointly held assets without discussion was the escalation. His jaw tightened. I was repositioning capital, short term. The market window required speed. Speed doesn't negate consent. He moved then, pacing once across the kitchen floor. Not angrily, calculating. "You made this public record," he said. "Do you understand what that does to credibility?" "I understand what undocumented transfers do," I replied evenly. That was the moment something shifted in his expression. Not rage, not panic. Regret. Not for taking the assets, for underestimating me. "They questioned me like I was trying to smuggle something," he said quietly. "They had serial numbers printed, dates, photos." "Yes," I said. You photographed everything. Yes. He exhaled through his nose slowly, almost in disbelief. Since when? Since documentation became optional in our conversations. Silence settled between us. He sat down finally, not defeated, just aware. I can return everything, he said after a moment. We can close the report, clarify. It was a misunderstanding. There it was, the attempt at reversal. Reversal requires that the damage be emotional, but this wasn't emotional. It was structural. The report reflects sequence, I answered. Sequence doesn't disappear because you regret the optics. His eyes lifted to meet mine fully for the first time since he walked in. You think I was leaving? I didn't respond immediately, because the truth was more nuanced than the accusation. I think you moved assets without partnership, I said, and that action stands on its own. He leaned back in the chair, studying me like he was seeing a different person. You could have just called me. Yes, I agreed softly, I could have. And that was the final fracture. Not anger, not shouting, the realization that I had chosen process over persuasion. Because persuasion invites negotiation. Process invites consequence. By filing before he boarded his flight, I removed the possibility of retroactive narrative control. And he understood that. Can this be fixed? He asked quietly. It wasn't a legal question. It was a relational one. I looked at him steadily. Trust doesn't reset, I said. It recalibrates. And some recalibrations can't restore the original setting. We didn't schedule the real conversation. It unfolded 2 evenings later, after the initial tension had cooled into something more deliberate. Daniel sat across from me at the dining table, the same place where I had once laid out gold coins in neat rows for documentation. The house was quiet. No television, no phones. Just 2 people and the truth between them. I miscalculated, he began. His tone wasn't defensive now. It was analytical. In what way? I asked. I thought I was managing risk efficiently, he said. I didn't account for your threshold. Threshold, as if this had been an engineering variable. My threshold wasn't crossed because of the money, I replied. It was crossed because of exclusion. He held my gaze. I wasn't excluding you. I was streamlining. Streamlining removes steps, I said evenly. You removed the partnership. There was no accusation in my voice, no raised volume, just accuracy. He leaned forward slightly. I needed flexibility. The more I explained, the more it felt like I was justifying every move. And it slowed momentum. There it was. I nodded slowly. So my presence became friction. He didn't answer directly. He didn't have to. Silence can confirm what words avoid. For years, I continued calmly, I absorbed that framing. I allowed my caution to be rebranded as anxiety, my questions as doubt. That was my participation in the imbalance. He looked surprised at that, perhaps expecting blame instead of shared acknowledgement. I never thought you were weak, he said quietly. I know, I replied. You thought I was stable, and that's not an insult. No, I agreed. It's an assumption. We sat with that for a moment. The absence of heat made the truth sharper. You filed the report before I boarded, he said finally. Not accusing, observing. Yes. You didn't warn me. No. Why? Because warning invites concealment. Because confrontation invites spin. Because documentation protects sequence. But I answered simply. Because once the line was crossed, it wasn't a discussion. It was a record. He exhaled slowly. You were preparing long before that. Yes. Another silence. You don't trust me, he said, not angrily. I trust patterns, I answered. That was the cleanest truth I could offer. Trust built on reassurance alone dissolves under pressure. Trust built on transparency withstands it. You could have ruined me, he said quietly. I didn't, I replied. And that was important. I hadn't exaggerated. I hadn't accused him of crimes he didn't commit. I hadn't humiliated him publicly. I documented what occurred. Nothing more. He studied me carefully. Not as the calm one. Not as the stabilizer. As an equal. And in that stillness, something became undeniable. I was no longer playing the role assigned to me. I had stepped out of it without raising my voice. And he felt the absence of that old version of me more sharply than any argument could have delivered. It's been 11 months since the day I opened the safe and found it lighter. The house is quieter now. Not because it's empty, but because the tension that used to hum beneath ordinary moments no longer exists. Daniel and I did not separate dramatically. There was no explosive ending, no public unraveling. There was simply a recalibration that revealed how differently we define partnership. We're in the middle of a structured legal separation. Calm, mediated, documented, appropriately documented. Some people have asked, carefully, indirectly, whether I regret filing the report, whether it might have been too much. I understand the question. Women who remain composed are often expected to remain forgiving in proportion, as if emotional restraint obligates perpetual accommodation. But I don't regret it, because the report wasn't punishment, it was alignment. For the first time in my adult life, I responded to a boundary breach with structure instead of explanation. I didn't plead to be seen. I didn't try to repair the perception. I honored the facts. And that changed me more than it changed him. I've learned something about quiet dominance. It isn't about control. It isn't about outmaneuvering someone or humiliating them in their weakest moment. It's about knowing exactly where your line is and refusing to negotiate it once crossed. For years, I mistook composure for self-sacrifice. I believed being the calm one meant absorbing impact so the relationship could remain intact. Now I understand something simpler. Stability that depends on silence isn't stability. It's a postponement. I still carry my black leather notebook. I still track things. I still document important details. But there's a difference in how I hold myself now. I don't soften my intelligence to maintain comfort. I don't minimize my standards to preserve harmony. I don't allow inclusion to become optional. Daniel once told me I was low maintenance. I've come to realize what he meant was predictable. Predictable in my patience, predictable in my forgiveness, predictable in my restraint. I'm still restrained, but I am no longer predictable, and there's a quiet strength in that. We speak occasionally now, logistically, respectfully. There is no hostility between us, just clarity. He understands something he didn't before. Calm does not mean compliant. Silence does not mean unaware. And grace does not mean permission. As for me, I no longer define myself by how well I stabilize other people's volatility. I define myself by how precisely I protect my own boundaries. And that precision feels like freedom. When people hear this story, they sometimes wait for the dramatic ending. They expect anger. They expect revenge. They expect me to say that everything collapsed spectacularly. It didn't. What collapsed was an assumption. The assumption that quiet women don't keep records. The assumption that patience has no limit. The assumption that calm equals compliance. My husband emptied the safe. He didn't know I'd photographed every serial number, and the police report was filed before he boarded his flight. Those facts aren't dramatic. They're procedural, but the procedure is powerful. What I've learned is this: emotional intelligence without structural boundaries becomes self-erasure. You can be kind. You can be composed. You can be slow to anger. But if you never formalize your limits, someone else will quietly redefine them for you. I didn't shout. I didn't humiliate. I didn't exaggerate. I documented. And documentation doesn't attack character. It protects reality. There's a form of dominance that doesn't raise its voice. It doesn't seek applause. It doesn't need a final speech. It simply aligns action with principle. If you've ever been labeled the calm one, if you've ever swallowed a concern because you didn't want to seem dramatic, if you've ever felt your intelligence being gently reframed as overthinking, ask yourself this: are you maintaining peace or postponing accountability? I genuinely like to know your perspective. At what point does silence stop being strength and start becoming permission? At what point does silence stop being strength and start becoming permission?